welcome to the September edition of the Red Review. My name is Emily Steers. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm coming to you from the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Attawandaron peoples, also known as Guelph, Ontario.
And my name is Daniel Terade, he, him pronouns, and I'm coming to you from the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat people. That is to say, I am from Toronto. And like all the people working on this podcast, I live and work on stolen Indigenous land from across Turtle Island. And before we even begin the podcast, I would like to recognize that there can be no reconciliation without restitution. And that includes land back and seizing the assets of the major resource corporations and returning them to the commons.
We've got an interesting review for you this week. Obviously, we're going to be talking a little bit about the federal election, but we're also going to be talking, once again, about broader foreign policy and some things that you can do in your communities going forward actively on issues that we've talked about on this podcast before. And just a content warning as we begin, we are going to be discussing things like police brutality in response to Indigenous land defenders and the houseless encampment evictions, and we will also be discussing sexual violence.
Absolutely. So we hope you enjoy. And as always, before we get into the meat and potatoes of this podcast, we're going to turn it over to our comrade Ellen on the West Coast, who will share with you who isn't sponsoring us this month.
This month, we want to highlight a recent strike that just took place at the American snack food company Nabisco from August 10th to September 18th. The workers of the Bakery, Confectionery, Tobacco Workers and Grain Millers International Union walked out due to dire conditions they faced during the COVID crisis, including no contract for 1,000 unionized workers, a two-tier healthcare plan, and a change in shifts from 8-hour days to 12-hour days without overtime pay. This while Nabisco, known as Christie's in Canada, reported a 12% increase in revenues during the pandemic and the doubling of the profits in 2021 of its parent company, Mondelez International. This month, then, we are proud to announce that we are not sponsored by Nabisco, the company that has manufactured cookies, crackers, candy, and chocolate since 1898, and who owns the largest bakery in the world in Chicago. This strike is an example of union solidarity, bringing in the support of the Railroad Workers United, who refused to deliver baked goods supplies to the Portland Union Pacific supply trains. The workers, whose slogan was "No contracts, no snacks," won a 4-year agreement with no change to the healthcare plan, an increase in Nabisco's contribution to the 401k pension, a $5,000 bonus, and a 2.5% pay increase for 2021, and a 60-cent wage increase for each of the remaining years of the contract. It was considered a resounding success for the workers at Nabisco, and we salute these workers for their victory in what was a real struggle during the pandemic.
Thank you, Ellen. And now let's talk about the election. Emily, election night, what were you doing?
Drinking gin and tonics on the phone with my partner and just kind of bemusedly watching exactly the same thing happen as 2019.
So I had something very similar, just absent the gin and tonics. I was probably just smoking a lot, to be honest. So watching on CBC, CTV, where were you watching?
I was watching on CBC, and then I found out later that Pam Palmater and Naomi Klein were doing their own election coverage, which I'm really bummed that I missed, because I think I would have enjoyed watching that much more.
Yeah, so I also did not know that on election night. It was just, I didn't realize how much election coverage was basically the same as like a horse race being called by commentators. There was virtually zero discussion about policy, and it was all about just the personalities of the leaders and who's going to win the next episode of like American Idol. That was essentially the vibe I got from watching CTV coverage, which was just abysmal.
Yeah, and I mean, I get that, you know, they're nonpartisan entities. They can't really talk about politics too much and actual meaningful policy, but it was frustrating to watch, I won't deny.
So we will cover, as much as it's necessary here, what happened on election night, but more than anything, and like always, what our goal here is at the Red Review is to talk about the revolutionary demands that workers, that people ought to be putting forward. And there are a few demands that no matter who was elected on election night, they would not come to fruition. that work needs to be done outside of the electoral cycle, and we'll talk about that. But first, let's just recap what happened on September 20th. The 2021 federal election, Justin Trudeau called this to gamble on winning a majority of seats. But ultimately, everything ended up looking exactly like 2019, like uncanny. So the same parties are still in power. Each party has roughly the same number of seats. But with each party failing to make gains, and this was really an election cycle that should have been ripe for, parties campaigning on systemic change, no party really took that opportunity. Justin Trudeau is considerably weakened as a prime minister. There's not going to be an election for a while. There's zero appetite for that. And as a result, a minority liberal government will again have to lean on the NDP to be able to pass any sort of policy. And this was the same context in which the NDP successfully pushed the Liberals to, enact CERB and other really necessary supports during the pandemic. This is then an opportunity for the Labour-based New Democratic Party to assert itself and to wrestle more concessions from our ruling class.
Yeah, the only party that made any serious gains in this election was the People's Party. So they've built a base around reactionary, anti-lockdown and anti-vax politics, drawing voters from across the political spectrum. We know there was a lot of commentary about a lot of conservatives losing votes to the PPC, but they came from all political stripes. So while voters may not agree with the white supremacist, fascist base of the PPC, they've got their foot in the door, and we need to hold the corporate media accountable for giving so much attention to the PPC and legitimizing their platform.
Yeah, the coverage during the election night and before it, again, it focused so much on the personality of the leaders. There was never a serious discussion given to platform, to policy. And that's an environment in which, this proto-fascist PPC party can thrive, because if you just take their sound bites, they're the only party out there that was really speaking to systems. All the other parties were reformist. They basically tripled their vote count from 2019. They didn't win any seats, and everybody is breathing a sigh of relief, but they've built a base, and in a lot of ridings, they were getting 10, 15, 20% of the vote. That's substantial.
It is. And I know there's been a lot of people talking about how the PPC, in the next election cycle, hopefully anyway, we won't be talking about lockdowns and masks and vaccine mandates and all that, which is what they were really, really able to capitalize on because there was no party who was directly opposed to vaccine mandates or mask mandates. Even Erin O'Toole and Jason Kenney have had to back down on that one after being staunch opponents of it for a while. But the thing is, with a reactionary party, there will always be some other reactionary, incendiary topic that they are able to capitalize on. So the PPC, when they ran in 2019, they were campaigning against the carbon tax. They were campaigning against what they say are unfair, restrictive policies about climate and campaigning on anti-immigration sentiment. I am very leery of anyone who is quick to dismiss them saying, their main platform point was being anti-vax and anti-mask, so what are they going to have to campaign on next time? They are a reactionary party at a fundamental level, and there will always be some other reactionary BS for them to capitalize on and campaign on. And so we need to be ready to stand against reactionary political movements, just like what formed the PPC, and offer viable alternatives to people who are frustrated with systemic inequities.
Absolutely. That's exactly the case. And as capitalism continues to fail and spiral into its final collapse, there will be more things to react against. In the same way in Europe, there was huge reactionary movement against, the migrant crisis over there. Mm-hmm. That was not as big of a reaction here because the migrants couldn't travel across the Atlantic Ocean. But the Mediterranean, they could. And that's when you saw these fascist parties in Greece and Italy emerging because there was a huge crisis, and in Hungary. That will eventually come here as well. You even saw how Trump was able to campaign against the caravans coming up from Central America. Same thing. We need to be very leery of the PPC, and we need to grow our own anti-system party that's based in the working class, and it's based on justice for all rather than this very reactionary party that offers no solutions except for anger, vitriol, and eventually, we'll see as it develops, but they'll start offering their own systemic solutions, but we won't like them.
Leaving aside the PPC, they're the ones who made the major gains, but the major loss of the night was definitely the Green Party. Their vote share shrank from 6% in 2019 to less than 2%. And Annamie Paul, the former leader of the Green Party, came a distant fourth in Toronto Centre.
We talked about it already in some previous episodes, but the Zionism that came through with Annamie Paul being elected, and again, she started already in somewhat of an auspicious beginning. She didn't acknowledge it, but it was a very tightly contested leadership race. The first leadership race in the Green Party in a long time. As Elizabeth May stepped down, it was Annamie Paul versus Dimitri Lascaris, and they were on opposite ends of the political spectrum. And even though the final leadership race was decided only by a few percentage points, Annamie Paul led as if there was a really strong mandate within the Green Party for these policies that really don't address the climate crisis. And we saw the Zionist current come to the forefront, leading to one of their only 3 MPs crossing over to the Liberals. And really the internal turmoil combined with not having a real systemic policy for climate change led to their collapse.
Yeah, and I don't want to deny Annamie Paul being a Black woman, a Jewish woman, as the leader of a federal party. I don't want to downplay the racism or discrimination that she experienced in any way. That absolutely did contribute to her negative perception, but it's also important not just to rely on that and to also be critical of her politics at the same time and keep a really strict focus, not on identity, but on concrete material policy.
Yes, absolutely. Whereas the Green Party lost share, the New Democratic Party really remained stagnant. And I have to say, as partisans of the NDP, that is probably my biggest disappointment of the evening then.
Absolutely. It was really galling to see them failing to seize upon the crises that pandemic laid bare in our capitalist society. And despite a radical grassroots that clamored to pass progressive resolutions and progressive policy at the NDP convention, shout out to the Socialist Caucus and the Courage Coalition, this election cycle really saw the NDP brass doubling down on personality politics, highlighted more than anything by Jagmeet Singh's likability and the subsequent branded merch. Despite polls showing that Jagmeet is by far the most well-liked political leader, the NDP gained only 1% more votes in this election and just 1 extra seat in the election.
So the NDP, it's a party that's based in working class institutions. It's the only party in North America, or at least Canada and the United States, where trade unions are represented directly at NDP conventions. That is the reason why a revolutionary party like Socialist Action spends so much time campaigning and working within the NDP. It is where you have organized workers, and any revolution will need to win over organized workers. But at the same time, we need to be really sharp with our criticism of the party brass, which is, right-wing social democrats. They're pro-capitalist, committed to reforms that will not actually achieve really that much at all, and fundamentally very undemocratic. More than ever, you saw the NDP hand-picking candidates for different ridings without holding a local nomination meeting. And this is something that's to the detriment of socialist organizers who got stonewalled by the party. And most of the money then was spent on, the leader's tour and these TV ads that highlighted Jagmeet Singh as a person rather than the NDP as a party that will fight for workers.
Jagmeet Singh failed to draw on the lessons learned by Canadian imperialist crimes in Afghanistan, in Libya, and Haiti. He is loyal to NATO. He was silent on the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Absolutely nothing mentioned about the Ferry Creek blockade, has been very inconsistent about his discussion in Israel, and he has been seeking a more anti-China policy.
So there was a brief moment during the campaign where Trudeau came after Jagmeet Singh, where he tried to caution Jagmeet Singh, which was very patronizing, as saying you can't go after the rich with, quote, infinite zeal. Now, I found that quite laughable because the NDP policy was a 1%, a one-time 1% tax on wealth over $10 million. That wouldn't fund really any of the critical programs that are needed to lift people out of poverty, things like a national childcare program or massive social housing, or free post-secondary education, or an all-service Medicare system that includes pharmacare, includes mental health care and vision care and dental care. It really wasn't enough. But for a moment, the rhetoric, the class rhetoric we need the NDP to embrace was there for a moment. And unfortunately, it wasn't built upon.
I really actually quite appreciated his comment in reply to that of "just watch me." Quoting Trudeau Sr., for those who don't know, possibly our younger listeners who don't know, during the FLQ crisis in Quebec in the 1980s, Trudeau Sr. was called into question about his use of the War Measures Act during peacetime, which led to the illegal detainment of hundreds of people not connected to the crisis and massive civil rights violations. A reporter asked him, "Mr. Trudeau, how far will you go?" And he smiled and said, "Just watch me." So Jagmeet Singh invoking that particular memory is quite powerful. And as you say, it was a moment of that zeal, that passion, and that advocacy that we need to see. It was only there for a moment, but we need to see that from the NDP all the time.
All the time. And even when it's not an election cycle, it needs to just be in the streets. It needs to be in the unions. The NDP is in that position. They are a structure that could be a catalyst for real societal change. But instead, they're electoral to the core and reformist to the core, meaning their main priority is winning an election, even if it doesn't change anything. They campaign on likability. It didn't work. And in any case, if they did win, what would that change? People voting for someone that they like is not a mandate for society to be fundamentally reoriented to the working class. That's where we are as members of the NDP Socialist Caucus, as revolutionaries that are partisans of the NDP. We need to push them to fully embrace a working class agenda.
And also, it cannot be understated that a big part of why we are in the NDP is not because we think that they are the party that are going to lead us to revolution, but it's so that we can connect with working class organizers and grassroots organizers who are on the ground doing the work and build solidarity, build meaningful, practical solidarity with groups all across the country who want to see change enacted, who want to fight for this change in meaningful ways. That's a big part of why we are involved in the NDP.
And for the same reason, then, we must mourn that some workers who are being misled by their own labor leaders, like the president of Unifor, they are still being drawn to the Liberal Party. Which is way worse because there's this siren call of strategic voting. If you don't want the Conservatives, you have to vote Liberal. Even though in reality, they're virtually indistinguishable. They're both parties of Bay Street. None of them will do anything to challenge the systemic failures of capitalism. But the treadmill of strategic voting remains. Actually, there's a poll that came out a few days after the election, and it was exactly half of Canadians admitted that they voted strategically. What a indictment on our democracy that half the people that vote in our election don't even vote for what they want, but rather out of fear of what could happen.
While we're talking about voting strategically and how people vote, it's also worth noting that this election saw one of the lowest voter turnouts in over a century. The voter turnout was just under 60% of the eligible voting population. That's appalling. That means over 40% of people had no say in this democratic process, and not for lack of trying. It is worth noting that because this snap election was called and they only had 36 days to prepare, Elections Canada was scrambling to find staff, to find suitable locations, and to actually run them effectively. And as we saw on election day, that completely fell to pieces. I know I was here in Guelph, and they were completely unprepared for students to vote because there was no on-campus voting stations. So every single student in residence was sent to the same neighborhood polling location that was completely unprepared for the influx of students, and people were waiting in line for over 3 hours. Whereas other polling stations in Guelph, most of them only had maybe 10-minute wait.
Students in particular, young people were disenfranchised, obviously disabled people, elderly people. If you see a line that's going to take 2 hours to wait in, and you're a person that can't stand for 2 hours, or can't go 2 hours without someone to look after your children, like there was huge disenfranchisement. All we have in Canada is this very liberal democracy, electoral democracy, and even that is so mismanaged, intentionally, I'm sure, in a lot of cases, The parties that benefit from this disenfranchisement are going to be the liberals and the conservatives. All these other groups affected are going to be disproportionately leaning NDP.
Exactly. While, we're not supporters of Annamie Paul, I think it is worth noting that her riding saw the biggest decrease in voting stations. Normally, the riding of Toronto Centre has 91 polling locations. This year, they had 15. You heard that right. 15.
Wow.
So whether or not it's intentional, it's voter suppression. Voter suppression by neglect or by malice is still voter suppression. It still leads to a less democratic, less equitable society. And, election days only come once every couple of years, but as revolutionary socialists, these campaigns are just a tiny interruption to our otherwise continuous organizing efforts. Any concessions won during elections will only be possible by building up our own organizations, our platforms, and our demands in strengthening communities, our workplaces, unions, and in the streets. So the rest of the podcast, we're going to be dedicated to transitional demands that weren't on offer during this election, foreign policy that was neglected or not addressed at all, and the work that we need to do to bring them to the forefront of popular struggle.
Yeah, so with that, let's talk about Palestine. Like always, the struggle for Palestinian liberation continues, and in Canada, we, socialists, must continue to play our part. Although the recent federal election did not yield any significant shifts in the number of seats held by each party, elections are always an opportunity to intervene. Entrenched power in Canada depends upon imperialist relationships with states around the world, and this is not something to be underestimated. Nevertheless, the issue of Palestine spurred many activists to engage with electoral politics this time around. The horrors of Israeli aggression in May of this year brought a whole new wave of enthusiasm for the liberation of Palestine on a scale really never witnessed before in Canada. And in no doubt, it was to match the scale of Israeli violence and the destruction of Gaza. And although we can have no illusions regarding the possibilities of electoral politics, some of this new energy was channeled into various attempts to get Palestine on the federal table, which is always worth discussing and worth highlighting.
So one of the main ways to channel this energy when it's visible and relevant is to encourage politicians, or more likely pressure them, into making pro-Palestine statements or taking pro-Palestine stances on record. Vote Palestine, a group consisting of many activist organizations that are focused on this issue, created a pledge for candidates to sign, indicating their commitment to peace and justice in the region, specifically by asking candidates to take firm stances on BDS, the Canadian arms trade with Israel, and respect for international law regarding International Criminal Court investigations against Israel, and a rejection of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, the definition making it far too easy to conflate criticism of Israel with actual anti-Semitic tendencies. Candidates who signed this pledge mostly came from the NDP, the Communist Party of Canada, the Green Party, and the Bloc Québécois, for a total of 71 signees, none of them coming from either Liberal or Conservative parties, or the PPC, but that's not shocking. Left-wing parties tend to support Palestine, and so these results are hardly surprising, but evidently the parties with the most power still view the benefits of supporting Zionism and the Israeli state as outweighing the need to support Palestine.
That's the important thing. The people that aren't signing this, they're making a strategic choice based on polling in a lot of cases. And when it comes to the liberals and conservatives, well, they would rather lose than undermine Israel. Because in terms of the global picture of capitalism, Israel is super critical, which is why the campaign to liberate Palestine is conversely so critical for us socialists. There was also a more direct approach taken by activists to volunteer with electoral campaigns. A different group called Canada Palestine Vote mobilized volunteers for 3 major NDP campaigns in swing ridings, which were Kitchener Centre, Davenport, and Parkdale High Park, which is my riding. I did go out door knocking one day for Paul Taylor because this NDP MP candidate was pro-Palestine. These ridings were selected because the NDP candidates stood a good chance of winning and expressed pro-Palestinian stances either by signing the Vote Palestine pledge or by some other means in the past. Bizan Zubi, the candidate for the Kitchener Centre riding, was the only Palestinian-Canadian candidate in the race. She ended up losing to Mike Morris, who is also pro-Palestinian, fortunately, but the race was close, and activists were able to give her campaign a solid boost. Same goes for the ridings in Toronto, which both ended up neck and neck against the Liberals. And notably, in the case of Alejandro Bravo in Davenport, the results were actually unable to be confirmed for a few days after the election because the margin was less than, a couple hundred votes. In order to guarantee the success of candidates like Zuby, who can attempt to advocate for Palestine from within Parliament itself, more efficient and coordinated electoral activism is needed next time around.
Indeed. And activists, naturally, we never stop protesting, and many protests were held during this election as well. From banner drops on bridges, to work maintaining public consciousness on the issue of Palestine, to the Canadian BDS Coalition and supporters from Socialist Action protesting a fundraising dinner of Chrystia Freeland's, the momentum has been maintained well beyond expectations from this previous May. With dedication, this issue can be kept alive in public discourse right up to the next election, and these tactics can be implemented again, hopefully to a greater effect.
The final major tactic employed by these various activist groups, and like always, we will include the information in the description of this podcast. If you are drawn to the cause of the Palestinian people, we encourage you to get involved with these groups. Now, this final major tactic then was to distribute information on MP candidates regarding their stances on Palestine, or giving people the tools to find out for themselves. The Canada-Palestine Vote also took part in this side of things. They produced both reviews of individual candidates and tutorials for researching their stances on one's own, which was distributed mostly through the Instagram account at Canada_Palestine_vote. Again, link will be in the description. These tutorials included methods for searching through every tweet ever made on the topic by a candidate and everything mentioned on the subject in Parliament itself. And other organizations, such as Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, have provided election guides, grading each party based on several criteria related to Canada's specific involvement in the conflict. As expected, the NDP earns their highest approval, with Liberals and especially Conservatives coming in at the bottom. These types of tactics give voters the information they need to make a rational choice when they go to the polls. Do they want to indirectly support Zionism and the state of Israel by voting in favor of Canadian imperialist support for Israel? Or would they rather vote for someone with a record of pro-Palestinian stances?
So all these tactics are useful and they complement each other. Asking politicians to take firm stances, volunteering for their campaigns, attending protests, and spreading information wherever possible about candidates are all useful to the cause. While it is the view of us at Red Review that only a revolution of the working class can truly bring an end to Canadian imperialism and thus an end to Canada's involvement in the ongoing colonization of Palestine, these tactics must be employed during election seasons to maximize our political influence and visibility. Outside of elections, our attention must be given to creating and sustaining the infrastructure to keep attention on Palestine, on Canada's involvement in Palestine, and bringing in support so that we're ready to do it again in the next election as well. Electoral politics cannot and will not end imperialism, but over time we can win incremental gains and radically shift public consciousness to make it a politically divisive issue. For example, given their stances on the Canadian support for Israel, the NDP federal victory would be favorable for the Palestinian cause. The NDP has adopted into their party policy a call for an end of arms sales to Israel and an end to building supplies being shipped to the illegal settlements in the West Bank. So the NDP still has to contend with established capitalist power, but they already do have pro-Palestinian stances at the federal level. So after lending direct support to their campaigns, they are now accountable to making demands for this issue to be on the floor of the House of Commons.
That's one of the strategies we have to keep in mind. Big props to Will, a member of our party, for all of his work as an anti-Zionist Jew in the struggle and for organizing this and getting me involved in some door knocking. It was the first time I door knocked for the NDP, and it was something that I was brought to because of this angle of supporting the Palestinians. I don't know if I would necessarily commit my own personal energy to a federal election for the NDP as a reformist party if that wasn't something I felt confident in regarding my local candidate.
And it would be remiss not to mention the near collapse of the Green Party connected to, in no small part, the issue of Palestine. Enemy Paul's Zionism, and particularly her staffer Noah Zatzman's Zionism, did not go unnoticed by a lot of the party's left-leaning membership, who have historically advocated for the Palestinian cause. It caused a major rift in the party, which perhaps in part explains the decline in seats for the Greens. Other factors are involved absolutely in this decrease in support for the Greens, and I'm sure there will be a lot of introspection and a lot of ink spilled on what's going on in the Green Party. But this issue really did fragment the party beyond all hope of actually increasing their share of seats in the House. It is worth noting that many of the MP candidates put forward by the Greens did sign the Vote Palestine pledge mentioned earlier, but the fragmentation was ultimately too vast for the party to handle. Nevertheless, it's an important takeaway here that Zionism does not pay in progressive politics.
Here at Red Review, our listeners will have been angered by the recent news that Texas passed a draconian anti-abortion law outlawing abortion after 6 weeks and offering a $10,000 incentive for individuals to sue anyone aiding and abetting an abortion. Shamefully, a Republican senator in Florida is now tabling a similar law, and so the struggle for abortion rights in the United States continues. We at Red Review would like to take this opportunity then to point out the struggles here in Canada and highlight that the federal Liberal government has been delaying action on a restrictive law in New Brunswick. Instead of enforcing the Canada Health Act that allows abortion, the federal government has permitted the New Brunswick government to require abortions to be performed only in hospitals with a certification of 2 doctors. Clinic 554, a reproductive health provider, in particular, has not been funded by the New Brunswick government for the abortions provided there. This clinic, which used to be the Morgentaler Clinic, has operated valiantly in the face of unnecessary barriers to providing abortions, particularly to low-income pregnant people. To date, the federal government has only withheld a token $140,000 from the health transfer budget to the New Brunswick government. This flies in the face of the long civil rights struggle of Dr. Henry Morgentaler and numerous other abortion providers and their supporters in an earlier period of Canadian history. We at Red Review would like to send our solidarity to these abortion defenders and include them in our Canadian Heritage Moment for October 2021.
So this has been a lot of discussion about the federal party, but as we know, there are municipal elections happening across Canada in 2022, as well as a lot of provincial elections, including here in Ontario. While the federal elections tend to get the most attention and the most participation, it's really worth paying attention and getting involved in municipal level and provincial level politics, because that's where a lot of material change can really be affected, and it's where a lot of concrete policies that affect our day-to-day lives are implemented.
And one of those major campaigns that we seek to put front page during the municipal elections in 2022 is defund, disband, disarm the police. Listeners of this podcast will recall that we have previously covered 1492 Landback Lane and also the brutal encampment evictions carried out by Toronto police earlier this summer. We have an update for you on this, and we're going to segue from this update into what needs to be done in the lead up to the 2022 municipal elections. So in the days leading up to the federal election, members of Socialist Action gathered with other groups outside of John Tory's, and that's Toronto Mayor John Tory, his bougie condo, and this was called, this action, to stop the criminalization of encampments and the houseless, to drop the fines and charges against encampment residents and the people who helped protect encampments from brutal police violence, and to roll out affordable and supportive housing. That was why we were there. It was a press conference. It was a very radical press conference, but it was a press conference. The people who spoke stood in front of photographic evidence of the abuse they suffered at the hands of Toronto police. It was really a people's action. And this lineup of speakers included Schuyler Williams, a leader of 1492 Landback Lane. As this peaceful press conference concluded, we all learned in the audience that plainclothes Toronto police arrested Schuyler Williams and 2 other encampment defenders as they walked away from this action. They were thrown into unmarked vans and hauled off to 14th Division. Like previous instances of police brutality in Toronto, we the people descended on 14th Division to demand that they free our comrades who were guilty of nothing but standing by their houseless neighbors. I was there that day. I biked over to 14th Division, and there, like always, we saw the monopoly that the state has on violence. As we got there, the first thing that the police did was they walked around with buckets and they picked up all the stones that could potentially be used against them. We were forced back to the sidewalk, facing off against the police who had their tasers, their pepper spray, their guns all ready to go. There were drones and helicopters flying above, and there was like a dozen cops on horses. Meanwhile, on our side, we had pizza, we had water, we had the people's power. And after the standoff lasted about 6 hours, all the people that were arbitrarily detained for no good reason were released. The fight continues, though, for the charges against these people, which includes comrades from our own party who were arrested during some of those encampment evictions earlier in the summer. That fight continues.
And in the days following that, we have learned that the Toronto police have spent over $2 million to evict just 60 encampment residents, which totals up to about $33,000 per person evicted. Imagine what could have been done with $33,000 per person to help them find stable, supported housing. But no, that's not how the capitalist system do. Defunding, disarming, and disbanding the police remains a key demand for anti-capitalists. The state police exist to protect private property above all else, as is seen with the brutalization of Indigenous land and water defenders at 1492 Landback Lane, Fairy Creek, and the Wet'suwet'en and Secwepemc territories. If the police were on our side, they would join us in blockading these projects which undermine Indigenous self-determination and threaten ecological and environmental catastrophe. But the question of defunding, disarming, and disbanding the police and military hardly surfaced during the federal election. Tories, Liberals, and NDP all committed to reforming the RCMP by instituting new training and policies, code for giving them more funding.
Yeah.
In fact, only the Green Party included any language around defunding the RCMP, although they stopped well short of advocating for disarming and disbanding the state police apparatus in its entirety. So with the federal parties beholden to bourgeois interests, they do remain incapable of advocating for defunding police because state police are necessary for capitalist domination. All of the current victories are won by the struggle and the direct action of organized grassroots movements.
On that note, we do have another positive update. When we started this podcast, I didn't expect that we would be having as many positive updates to provide, but it really has been a few years of sustained pressure from below. So just a few days ago, on September 28th, a BC judge refused to grant Teal Jones, that private logging company in British Columbia, an extension to their injunction against old-growth logging blockades on southern Vancouver Island, where Fairy Creek is, and other areas that are being logged. Even though allowing the injunction to expire would hurt the company's bottom line, Justice Douglas Thompson argued that, quote, the methods of enforcement of the court's orders by the RCMP have led to serious and substantial infringement of civil liberties, including impairment of the freedom of the press to a marked degree, and enforcement has been carried out by police officers rendered anonymous to the protesters, many of those police officers wearing thin blue line badges. All of this has been done in the name of enforcing this court's order, end quote. This victory came not because a judge decided that old-growth forests are more important than a private company's profit, but because there is, quote, public interest in protecting the court from the risk of further depreciation of its reputation, end quote. That was again from the same judge, which is basically what we've been advocating for this whole time. That's exactly it. We will never hurt them by appealing to their morality. We're going to hurt them by damaging the reputation of their institutions. by hurting their ability to make profit, by putting our bodies on the line, by unequivocally standing up for justice.
And by deliberately damaging their reputation as peacekeepers and people who are just upholding the law and fighting for justice in their own way. No. We know very visibly, thanks to the coverage by the press and by people at the Fairy Creek blockade, that the police are not there to protect, they are there to defend corporate interest.
So this is a concession to the organized grassroots. Is our job over? No. Instead, we want to build on this. We look forward to the 2022 municipal elections, where we seek to make the demand, defund, disarm, disband the police, a key issue.
Turning our attention to this municipal election concept. For issues under the federal jurisdiction, the federal government oversees the RCMP. But under this constitution, all other policing operates under the provincial level. At this level, some provinces, including Ontario, have separate provincial police forces. However, for the most part, the control is divided into the municipal police forces. Now, municipal councils do not have control over police forces. They are instead controlled by police service boards. These boards are headed by the mayor and comprised of delegates from the municipal council appointed by the lieutenant governor and by other citizens. They are responsible for consulting with chiefs of police to propose the police budget, and as municipal councils pay for their police forces, they have the power to approve or reject these proposed police budgets. We're going to get really into the weeds here.
Oh yeah.
So by extension, municipal councils can vote on budget cuts to the police. Thus, municipal officials on both municipal councils and police boards can decide the fate of police budgets. This has been seen in many Canadian cities during the recent amplified calls from the public to defund the police. Unfortunately, legislation suggesting even modest cuts were largely voted down.
Now into those weeds that we previously mentioned. Big shout out to Grace, who did this research for us. In Toronto, in June 2020, Toronto City Council brought forward legislation for a 10% cut to the 2020 police budget. And people might not be aware exactly how much the Toronto police gets as a budget allocation. This 10% cut to the police budget would amount to $107 million of their $1.22 billion budget. Wow, that's a lot of money. Now, there was a huge call from the community for cuts much bigger than that. We forward a 50% immediate cut to the police budget. But even this modest 10% cut was voted down with 8 yeses and 16 noes, including Mayor John Tories, who is essentially the police's biggest cheerleader. In its place, motions on police reform were passed, such as implementing body cameras. This police budget already accounted for around 10% of the total city budget for 2020, and it is the biggest single expenditure for the city. The same month, the Vancouver Police Board voted down a meager 1% cut to the police budget of $339 million. Even though that budget accounts for over 20% of the Vancouver's $1.62 billion budget.
The apparent commitment to police spending at a municipal level is really alarming, especially due to the current state of that spending. In 18 of Canada's largest cities, over half of them allocated more than 15% of their 2020 budget to policing alone, with cities in Western Canada allocating 20% or more. The issue with these numbers becomes striking when compared with other areas of spending. Police spending is far and away the biggest municipal expense. So for example, Winnipeg lands at big spender number 1. Winnipeg spends 26%, or $304.1 million of their $1.14 billion budget for the police service. That same year, 10%, or $115 million of this budget was directed to community services in general. So this is not rare, especially in Western cities. In fact, for all the large cities in Western Canada, from Manitoba to British Columbia, police spending is far and away their biggest expenditure.
In Vancouver, the same year that they dedicated $339 million to policing, they allocated only $65 million to addressing housing in general, well under half of which would be directed to affordable housing projects. In Calgary, in 2020, they spent $517 million on policing, and and, in contrast, directed only $15.3 million to affordable housing, a sector which was facing a huge crisis due to a $53 million cut in funding to the maintenance of affordable housing units over 3 years. It isn't just Western cities. Policing is consistently prioritized in municipal budgets, while vital community supports remain underfunded. When people decry defunding the police, we must put that into the context of all other services being continuously cut. We oppose the prioritization of policing above housing, above community supports, mental health supports, addiction supports, schools, libraries, paramedics, firefighters. All these other areas are underfunded compared to the police, which repeatedly receives bloated budgets that allow them to buy military equipment, operate drones and helicopters and horses, and to detain people for no good reason.
So in Toronto, the Social Development, Finance and Administration Division of the municipal government leads the city's equity and inclusion, poverty reduction, and community safety strategies. Big job! This division was allocated a 2020 operating budget of $59 million, in comparison to a police budget orders of magnitude larger, as we said, of $1.22 billion. Montreal directed $30.4 million to a similar division of government in 2020, while allocating $665 million to policing in that same year. And yet, even though they take up such a bloated portion of municipal spending, police budgets continue to be on the rise across Canada. Close to home, the average police budget increased across 16 municipalities from 2020 to 2021. They increased by an average of 3.26%, ranging from 1.6% increase in Waterloo, near me, to 4.8% in Sudbury. So this rise has been even more dramatic in some other cases.
In Edmonton, between 2015 and 2018, there was a 25% increase to its police budget. Notably, this rise substantially exceeds the increase in their overall city costs, which rose only 15% in the time period. So more and more cities are dedicating more and more of its budget to policing. How do we instigate change? Continuing to look at Edmonton, we see one successful occurrence of the municipal board passing a police budget cut. In July 2020, a vote was passed to cut the police services budget by $11 million over the next 2 years. Notably, this number pales in comparison to the popular cut to defund $75 million from the projected police budget increase between 2019 and 2022. In fact, some activists involved in these actions labeled the $11 million cut a slap in the face. It's a way of providing a very small concession to try and suck momentum out of popular movements. That is why we must continue even when we win small victories. We must build on victories rather than being complacent and thinking that, the cities will just listen to us anytime. No, they will listen when things burn. They will listen when we show up in the streets. They will listen when we get our own media coverage dominating the cycle, as what happened during the police evictions in Toronto. It was the cell phone recording of the police that dominated the coverage. It was not the mainstream media and their narrative that dominated.
Just to highlight the activism that took place in Edmonton that got this concession, a petition by Black Lives Matter Edmonton to the city councillors was to defund the police of the $75 million. This was signed by over 12,000 people. A group called Fight for Equity organized a rally against racism with over 15,000 attendees. The Edmonton mayor, Don Iveson, relayed having received 10,000 emails from local advocates and constituents calling for defunding the police by $75 million and reinvesting that money into community programs. So furthermore, over 100,000 people attended a digital rally and 10,000 demonstrators protested anti-Black racism alongside various marches in 2020. This powerful activism led to a public hearing spanning 2 weeks, during which over 150 citizens were heard regarding their views on the police, which ultimately resulted in the vote and the concession of $11 million of defunding the police services. While this is not necessarily a success story because, we didn't get the $75 million threshold told, it does demonstrate the ability of the community to dramatically alter police budgets and thus change the mindset and the politics around the carceral system through municipal level action. The community can also affect change through their elected municipal representatives. For example, it is a public and Googleable record of who voted for or against the motion to defund Toronto Police in 2020, or for any municipality's votes for that matter. If the community can elect representatives who do support restricting police spending, the legislation to make that happen has a better chance of passing, even if it is in a conciliatory, reduced capacity.
So I see the potential for something similar to the Vote Palestine project, where for the 2022 municipal elections, the people that support cutting the police budget can be given a boost by activists who give them their time and energy. And at the same time, we can launch our own propaganda campaign to make it front page news who on city council opposes even modest cuts to the police budget. The people who have shown us their true face and remain committed to a carceral system that disproportionately brutalizes Black and Indigenous people, a system that criminalizes drug use rather than treating it as a medical and social problem, a system that fully opposes any popular discontent around carbon-intensive development projects, around these development projects that don't benefit humans but benefit profit and the capitalists. Those are the people that we need to be shaming and naming, or rather naming and shaming. I like shaming more than naming half the time. And so we look forward to that. But beyond that, Socialist Action, we want to put out a call to all the community groups out there. And we've been doing this now for about a year, trying to build momentum for a 2022 socialist slate in Toronto, in Peel, and any other city that is having an election that we can muster.
I also do want to throw in another piece of news about the encampment evictions in Toronto, that the Toronto Ombudsman is launching an investigation into the city clearing of homelessness encampments this summer. While we can't say what they're going to find or what side they're going to come down on, because generally they do come down in favor of the police, it is very rare for police to experience accountability. It's worth noting that, months after this has been out of the news cycle, because of continued public pressure regarding these encampment evictions, regarding police brutality, they are taking notice and they are launching investigations because it is grassroots organizers that have called on them to keep them accountable.
So 2022, if a socialist action slate, or what we ideally want is a coalition of socialist groups and racial justice groups and grassroots organizers and other progressive groups, we want to come together, develop democratically and collectively our own program. What we put forward at this time is an immediate 50% cut to police budgets. In Toronto, that would free up $600 million.
The cost of an election.
The cost of a federal election, which we can immediately redirect to anti-poverty initiatives, to supportive housing. Rather than spending $2 million to clear 60 people from a park, we can put that money to providing supportive housing for those people. Same money, maybe even more affordable, but people will benefit. And that is what we want to come out of this federal election. What is the most effective campaign, the most effective way to direct public discontent, popular support for defunding the police? Well, one way is to bring it to municipal elections and wrestle some concessions out of the capitalist system while building up our own power simultaneously.
I also do want to take a moment to highlight some concerning rhetoric that has emerged recently. The New York Times and NPR in the United States recently ran stories where they repeated police rhetoric that because of the protests last summer, because of the civil disobedience that took place after the murder of George Floyd, police are claiming that there was a spike in violent crime, a spike in homicides, in murders, in sexual violence, because the police were under attack, quote unquote, and that they were unable to respond or adequately protect communities. These news media publications are running this story uncritically, repeating from their source, who's, CIA affiliated, FBI affiliated, police union affiliated sources, without critically challenging them, or indeed even looking at the statistics which show that over the past several years, violent crime and crime in general has massively decreased. They don't want you to know that, because if violent crime and crime in general is on the decrease, well, then why are we increasing police spending?
And that is what we need to be able to put out there. But as individual socialists, we have very limited access to the mainstream media. But when we are a campaign, a coalition that is building grassroots support for a socialist slate on city council, well, that will be taken more seriously. We will get some cameras on us.
And we will be providing a rhetorical alternative to the police narrative.
I want to actually then finish this section with an anecdote then about what the police narrative looks like when it gets called out by the people that are directly impacted by police violence and brutality. At that stop, drop, and roll out the housing press conference that we mentioned earlier outside of Toronto Mayor John Tory's bougie condo, there was one person that spoke. They are a professor at York, I believe. They live near Trinity Bellwoods, which is where one of the encampments was cleared out. And they answered the call to show up that day and defend our houseless neighbors. They were given a concussion and then arrested and charged with possessing a weapon. What was that weapon, Emily? Do you want to guess what that weapon was? The police are saying it's a weapon, so it has to be something that could be used to cause harm, of course.
Right. Was it a book?
No.
Was it a phone?
No. You're not even getting... It was a bottle of milk, which activists bring to be able to deal with the pepper spray that the police were using indiscriminately. So they actually brought something to keep people safe and to alleviate discomfort, but because it's something that you can hold in your hand and in theory throw at the police, they charged them with having a weapon. This narrative was continued. Know what the police did that day when we all showed up at 14th Division? We had hundreds of people there. They released a press release while we were there, putting out warrants for the rest of 8 other people that defended our houseless neighbors during the encampment evictions. And would you not believe it, some of the charges that they were putting out there were possession of weapons. That's what the city was seeing. Those people that are at these rallies, they were trying to portray us as violent people, as criminals, as people that had no issue just causing wanton violence. No, the people that were there to protect people from the police. It was the police who broke bones, gave concussions, arrested people and withheld them from their medication for hours, and withheld them from legal counsel for hours. They are the violent ones. They are the violent ones.
This is one of the things that I think is really powerful about social media, and I had a professor once refer to this as surveillance rather than surveillance. It's like, we hold the camera now. You can't just cut away when the narrative is no longer convenient for you. We now have the camera and we can share what we know is true on our own ends. And we can support and connect and help each other to resist. And we can fight back against these propaganda lies that the mainstream media, like the New York Times and NPR and the Toronto Star and many other Canadian publications, are so eager to take up.
That's part of what our goal is to put out this other narrative. That's why at that press conference, we've already mentioned a few times, they held up the photos, the photographic evidence of police brutality. You can see the people bruised and battered. You can see them walking concussed with the police in the background laughing. That was what we put out there. And actually then...
And while we're talking about surveillance, it's worth mentioning that George Holliday, who's known for having filmed the beating of Rodney King back in the 1990s, has recently passed away due to COVID-19.
That was the tradition, and we saw that tradition continue with the person that filmed the brutal murder of George Floyd. Without the video evidence of that pig with his knee on George Floyd's neck for 10 minutes, without that video, you would not have had the spark. You would not have had the rally and cry around defund the police and Black Lives Matter otherwise.
And that's the power of surveillance. Speaking of surveillance and the power of social media to instigate change, I want to talk about the Western University student walkout that happened last week on September 17th. In response to the dozens of cases of druggings that happened at a campus party, many sexual assaults, and the brutal beating of a first-year student, thousands of students at Western walked out of class. While only 4 people made reports to the London police, we know that there were many more assaults and violations that took place that went unreported. We don't need to discuss why people are hesitant to report to the police or to university campus administrators. We know why. We know why. But because of these demonstrations, the outcry on social media, the issue got national attention. Since then, Western has stated that they will be upping security measures as well as implementing mandatory trainings around consent and sexual violence for everyone living in residence and for anyone in a student leadership position to be able to recognize and intervene in instances of sexual predation. Of course, we know that Western is not the only campus dealing with systemic sexual violence, and in fact, it's replete in campuses all over the world and in many other spaces. We know additional policing isn't going to solve the issue of sexual violence. While we know that training and discussions around consent and sexual violence are really, really critical, what's really important is focusing these prevention efforts on people who are perpetrating sexual violence and not the people who are victims of it. Sexual violence can occur to anyone of any gender, but we do know that sexual violence is disproportionately committed by cisgender men. Because sexual violence is not about sex. We know that. It's about power. It's about asserting power over people you think are lesser than you. And so what needs to happen is a change in culture. And I'm calling on every single person listening now, have the conversations. Call out creepy stuff. Call out bad behavior. Intervene when you see something strange happening. Raise your kids and talk to anyone who has kids that you know about these issues. They are never, ever, ever too young to learn about consent. They are never, ever too young to learn about the risks. There are age-appropriate ways that you can discuss this, but the change must start on a communal level, on a cultural level. We know policing is not going to solve the issue. We know that mandatory training modules are only a tiny, tiny step. What needs to happen is there needs to be accountability processes, there need to be consequences for perpetrators, and meaningful changes to supports for survivors. That is the thing that is most lacking on campuses and in all levels of society is meaningful support for survivors. So we need to create those spaces. We need to create that safety in all of our communities, in all of our activism, in all of our organizing. We need to take accountability and change these power dynamics, change these cycles of violence and abuse. So I know that's a little bit heavy for a monthly headline recap, but I thought it was really, really important to highlight, and I just wanted to really commend all of the student leaders who are taking this initiative on, who are pushing this to the forefront of the national media. Despite the election coverage, they still managed to make headline news, so kudos to the student organizers. It is only through collective change that we are able to make any meaningful changes in our society. We need to gather together. We need to support each other through massive social changes.
On that note, let's go to Alberta and talk about the Superstore employees there that passed an overwhelming strike mandate. On September 24th, workers employed by Real Canadian Superstore, TM, represented by United Food and Commercial Workers Local 401, voted 97% in favor of a strike mandate.
Woo, woo, woo!
Now, that does not mean they're going on strike right now. What it means is that their union representatives are going back to the bargaining table and they're going to tell the bosses, if you do not give us a fair deal, we're going on strike. We're all down with it. They have 120 days with this strike mandate now in effect. And if further contract negotiations with the bosses break down, those Superstore employees are going on strike. UFCW Local 401, they represent 32,000 workers across Alberta. And part of this strike then would involve all 32,000 workers in this union and their families to boycott Superstore and all other stores owned by Galen Weston Jr. and the Loblaw cartel.
This strike is taking place because, as we know, Alberta is being really seriously overwhelmed with COVID-19 right now. The ICUs are on the verge of collapse, and Jason Kenney is refusing to put in place any restrictions or lockdowns that might slow down the rapid acceleration of COVID through communities that have lower vaccination rates. Particularly vulnerable are superstore workers and grocery workers who are not being given adequate protections, who are not being given support to prevent unvaccinated people coming in and being abusive towards staff, or any kind of sanitation protocols that might help superstore workers not catch COVID-19.
It's an issue of workplace safety, and that is where unions need to step up for all their workers. It's not enough just to say, well, it's a pandemic, what do you expect? No, people working for minimum wage, or really whatever wage at their work, should not be expected to run a risk, and in Alberta, it could be a substantial risk of contracting a deadly virus. As these workers, and we lend our solidarity to them, as they go towards a potential strike, one hurdle that they may face is the recently passed Bill 1, also known as the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act, which allows the government of Alberta to heavily fine, arrest, and charge individuals who, quote, unlawfully interfere with infrastructure, including pipelines, highways, utilities, and oil and gas production facilities, end quote. This was passed by Jason Kenney's United Conservative Party in reaction to the rail blockades erected in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en land defenders opposing the Coastal GasLink pipeline. It was not passed with the idea of people blockading a superstore, because that's what a picket line would be. If these workers go on strike, they're going to try and surround those stores because inevitably the bosses will try and bring in scabs to undermine collective organizing. And one thing the unionized workers can do is make it a hassle for people to get into that store. It will be interesting and important for us to follow to see if Bill 1 gets enacted, because you can make the argument that the superstore is also infrastructure.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, that they haven't used the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act to limit people protesting outside of hospitals, schools, and other care centers that are, requiring masks and vaccinations.
Yeah, so it's like Bill 1, but not like that. No, only when people are, targeting the for-profit oil sector.
Yep.
And maybe in this case, they will be enacting it to defend Galen Weston Jr. and his profit.
The working class across Canada needs to stand in solidarity with all striking workers, and we, the working class, need to defend our right to organize pickets, to withhold labor, and to blockade infrastructure.
Absolutely. That's our only power, and we must fight as much as possible, retain as much power as possible, and to build on it.
And finally, the last headline that we wanted to highlight was the release of Meng Wanzhou. After 2 years of being detained under house arrest by the Canadian state at the behest of the United States, the CFO of Huawei, Meng Wanzhou, was finally released when the U.S. Justice Department reached a deal with Meng Wanzhou and dropped their extradition request. The RCMP arrested Meng Wanzhou in December of 2018 after the U.S. issued the extradition request due to Huawei being accused of dealing with Iran, which the U.S. has put sanctions against. Of course, according to the UN, these sanctions are themselves illegal in the first place, but, Socialist Action came out demanding that Canada release Meng Wanzhou last year, not because, we love CFOs or anything, but because we see this arbitrary detention as just another episode in the escalating tensions between the US and China. We oppose this new Cold War. This economic and potentially, oh God, fingers crossed not, armed conflict will not help workers in Canada or in China, but rather will generate billions more in profits for weapons manufacturers and stoke reactionary, xenophobic, and broader anti-Asian sentiment that again divides the working class the world over. As always, our primary objective is to build the socialist movement in Canada and oppose our imperialist leaders that seek to wreak havoc elsewhere. Along with this, I do want to highlight that with the release of Meng Wanzhou in Canada has been the release of the two Michaels, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, who are two Canadians who were detained in China, many believe, in response to Canada's somewhat arbitrary detention of Meng Wanzhou. Now that they have been released, it is really, really critical to keep our attention on anti-China rhetoric and anti-China sentiment that is in the mainstream press and in public attention. We do not need more anti-Asian sentiment. COVID-19 has already galvanized immense amounts of anti-Asian hatred and anti-Asian violence. With the release of the two Michaels, it is likely that we will see an increase in anti-China rhetoric and anti-China sentiments. We need to be on high alert and fight back against this wherever we see it. We, the people, do not need to condone this new Cold War in any sense.
And that brings us to the end of our September coverage here at the Red Review. We hope you all enjoyed it.
As always, all of the links to stories that we were discussing today will be in the podcast description, and feel free to contact us if you have any questions about our stories or socialist action in general.
You can reach us at redreview@protonmail.com if you are interested in joining the revolutionary struggle. We invite you to join Socialist Action. We're organized from coast to coast, and our power is growing in direct opposition to this capitalist hellscape.
Thanks again so much, everyone, for listening from wherever you are in the world. And as always, stay safe, stay active.